Hello, everyone. Welcome to the webinar. I am Padmaja Sarathy. I'm presenting this webinar on Autism Spectrum Disorders, understand the characteristics in order to maximize academic, social, and behavioral outcomes. Let me repeat that. Autism Spectrum Disorders, understand characteristics to maximize academic, social, and behavioral outcomes. Let me thank AbleNet for organizing this webinar. And again, welcome to the webinar. This webinar, I don't know what is happening. In this webinar, we are going to focus on how we can understand better the characteristics, the unique and the distinctive characteristics, somewhat complex, of children with autism spectrum disorders. Also, it will help us to reflect and analyze our adult reactions to the students' behaviors and how we can try to lessen the challenge and its impact for the children as well as for the adults who are working with them. At the end of the webinar, I hope I have enabled you to be on a more reflective mode and to maximize the outcomes for children, but personalizing and customizing the intervention approach. And I also want to mention something at this point. I know you may have some questions to ask as we go through the different slides. I would appreciate it if you will understand that I will answer the chat questions at the end. I will try to allocate about 5 minutes for the chat questions, and or a little bit more or a little less. But, even if I don't finish and go through all of the slides, I will make sure at the end I will try to answer as many of the chat questions as possible. And thank you for your understanding. There is some issue. I don't understand why in advancing the slides. As I said, I'm Padmaja Sarathy, and I'm an author and a consultant. I have written a number of books, and I consult for school districts, and I also present at national conferences. And the next slide shows some of the things that are related to autism. I also have books written on significant disabilities, severe and multiple disabilities, and in the early childhood area. But these are some of the things that are in the area of autism. The most recent publication that you will see on the right-hand side is a quick reference guide called Autism Spectrum Disorders, 7 Steps of Support. That's published by National Professional Resources, and it's also available on the Amazon.com website. And these are resources that you can check out, and I have included the reference to them towards the end in the resources section. So, what are some best practices in serving students with autism spectrum disorders? The first and foremost is because of the unique, distinctive, and somewhat complex characteristics and needs of children with autism spectrum disorder, we do need to think always in terms of personalized support, and these supports have to be provided consistently and also cohesively. But, however, guiding these personalized interventions, we do have some best practices that we need to follow so that we achieve the maximum outcomes for these children. The first and foremost that we do know from research is the environmental and the structural support has to be strong because children with autism spectrum disorders do react pretty strongly if the environment is not supportive to them. The other thing that we do know is visual support is a must for children with autism spectrum disorder. We will also be looking at, and all of these areas we'll be touching on. We may not be able to expand because in a 1-hour webinar it's almost difficult, but you will walk away with some practical ideas that you can implement immediately. Academic support. We have to make sure that there is certain degree of instructional flexibility in order for our students with autism spectrum disorder to be able to gain academic outcomes. And also we have to make sure how that para-educator support is provided. Frequently, there is a heavy intensity of para-educator support for children with autism, and there are some issues that have come up, so we do need to make sure that it is effective but not too intrusive. The other thing, many children with autism spectrum disorders are supported with technology, both mainstream and assistive technology, and we have to make sure that matches the student's needs. And we will also be looking briefly at the social support that we can provide, so that one of the areas that of great need for children with autism spectrum disorder, the support is there. And there is a lot of research which is emerging that focuses on how we can teach children with autism spectrum disorders on guiding them and teaching them and coaching them how they can develop self-regulation skills. And what do we do in a crisis situation? We will be touching on all of these areas with some practical examples. And the next video, as you watch the video, think about the perceptions that people have of children with autism and the expectations that are colored by these perceptions, and the dreams and desires families may have, dreams and desires the individual with autism may have, and the desires and that we may have as educators, and how this will impact the accomplishments of the student. So next we move on to the video. I am hoping it'll work.
People say that the bumblebee should not be able to fly. According to the laws of aerodynamics, his wings are too short, his body is too big. But nobody ever told him about aerodynamics. So he doesn't know what he is and isn't capable of. Despite what everyone says, the bumblebee flies. I have autism, cerebral palsy, epilepsy, and some other things. When I was a baby, the doctor told my mom and dad that I would never be able to walk, read, write, or speak. But I can do all of that. I have done the impossible. Until now. Dun, dun, dun! I've never been on a date before. I went to preschool with her, but I haven't seen her since. What do I do? Goldie was very helpful. She told me I have to show off how handsome I am. I have to show off my way with words.
Yo, I'm Mr. Incredible. If you can be a better rapper than me, what?
She told me that I have to show off my fashion sense. Most importantly, I have to show off my moves. Thanks to Goldie's coaching, I'm ready for my date. Paige told me on the phone that she would bring a balloon to make it easier for me to find her. What do you want to do? We could go dancing. We could go to a fancy restaurant. We could take a trip to Italy.
You want to go to the playground?
For once, Goldie was wrong. You don't need to find somebody perfect or be somebody perfect. You just have to find another bumblebee to fly with.
I hope you liked the video. It was very moving. And it's our responsibility as educators to unlock that potential in every individual with autism spectrum disorders. And that begins with kind of understanding their complex characteristics. Many children with autism, I'm going to use the word autism and autism spectrum disorders interchangeably. Many of them, one of the major areas of challenge for them, for the child with autism, is social emotional reciprocity. Understanding the feelings, thoughts, ideas of others, and how to engage in social communication, and how to express their needs and wants, and which causes a lot of issues, because that causes a certain degree of frustration for them, because they do not know how to initiate that communication, or they may not know how to. And some of the things that we often see is their restricted patterns of interest and their repetitive patterns of behavior. The other major characteristic which impacts particularly their ability to adjust to the requirements in a school setting, classroom setting, is their need for sameness and their kind of behavioral lack of flexibility in their behavior. They may not even sometimes know the tasks that they have always done because of their lack of behavioral flexibility. And then sometimes what happens is the adults who respond, when we don't fully grasp what prompts certain behaviors in them, and we may end up labeling those behaviors as challenging and disruptive, this may add to the confusion and frustration both for the child and the adult who is responding to the behavior. And as I said before, one of the things is often when we are confronted with a problem behavior, we respond in a reactive mode and not always have the time or the background or the knowledge and skills sometimes to respond in a more reflective mode. And that is why it's extremely important to understand some of these characteristics. First and foremost, most often in our classrooms, we respond or we give directions in verbal directions, verbal directives, verbal instructions, verbal explanations. And that may cause some of the problems for children with autism because they think much more visually. And the other thing, even if we have some visual support, we may terminate that support too soon. And we may not consistently be using, even if they had a schedule which is supported with visuals, we may not be using them consistently in all the settings, which may make the transitions somewhat more difficult for them, and because of that, it may aggravate the problem. And we also tend to have a lot of frequent and repetitive verbal directions. We may provide kind of a lot of reminders which are verbally presented to them, and that may not work well with children. So as we work with children with autism, we need to be thinking about these things. And in a way, our responses may exacerbate the problem behaviors. So let's look at some of these issues. And kind of a beginning background knowledge, or maybe most of you already have this information. Is autism spectrum disorder a neurological developmental disorder? Yes. Is it true? Yes, it is true. At this point in time, we don't really have a cure. They are working on they are at the stage of identifying the genetic markers. Hopefully, we may have some solution down the line. At this time, we are working on how adults respond to their behaviors and how we teach them, the students with autism, coping strategies to cope with their own special needs and complex characteristics. Often we think academic skills are easier to teach than social skills. There is a certain degree of truth to it, but it may not always be true because it's how the academic tasks are presented to them. However, I do want to say at this point that social skills are even more challenging for them because of their hesitation in initiating social communication. And frequently we think they are loners by choice. It's not that they are loners by choice or that they don't like to have friends. Again, I'm going back to the previous point that they have difficulty initiating social interaction and communication. And as I said in the previous slide, they may not fully understand how to engage in social emotional reciprocity. Some of the things that have alarmed me when I have done presentations, the comments that I've heard from participants is that children with autism intentionally engage in problem behaviors because they have a poor attitude. Is it true? No, it is because frequently they do not know how to communicate their wants and needs. And or when things are not the same and they don't know what is expected of them, they may get anxious and fearful about the unfamiliar, and that may lead to some of their tantrum-like behaviors or tantrums. And this may add also when our reactions are somewhat confusing to them, that may add to the, aggravate the behaviors. And it is again because of their need for sameness, which is the next bullet point. Their need for sameness, does it enable them to adjust easily? No, it makes it very difficult for them to adjust to the situations. The reason I feel always it is important for us to understand the characteristics of children with autism in order to tailor our interventions appropriately is because there have been so many disturbing incidents that have been reported in the news media and also by the National Disabilities Rights Network. I am not going to be touching on every one of those incidents. And the reason why I want to highlight one or two of them is that emphasizes the need for a personalized, customized intervention to support children with autism spectrum disorder. The first bullet, a second grade child with autism spectrum disorder was upset and he was screaming at an after-school program. He just transitioned from the day school program into an after-school program that was at the same school, and the teacher at the after-school program heard him screaming and shouting and throwing himself on the floor. She picked him up, held him over a trash can with his head down into the trash can and shook him, saying that he needs to shake that screaming out of him, which can be terribly scary for a child with autism. One of the things that I did not mention in the characteristics is many children with autism spectrum disorders, they do have sensory issues. When even somebody touches them, that can exacerbate their problem behaviors. They may not like to be touched. Even a small thing like a little tag on their T-shirt at the back, touching them can make them fearful, can increase their anxiety level, can increase their stress level, which will in turn kind of make them respond in a more aggressive manner or engage in problem behavior. So it is very important that we do not respond in a reactive mode. I want to stop this scream, and so I am going to kind of teach him a lesson, and I'm also going to shake that screaming out of him. The other thing that I want to point out is, despite the fact this is the last bullet, a 9-year-old with autism was placed in a closet with a small window on 78 occasions when he did not comply with the teacher's directions. When we know a certain approach, a certain preventive approach, we may think about it as a preventive, but it's actually a punishment-based approach, does not work, it's about time to stop and regroup and rethink and come up with a better solution. How could we continue with the same approach is a question we need to ask ourselves and say, what do we need to do in order to make sure that we provide a more student-specific and setting-specific intervention. In responding to children with problem issues, children who engage in tantrum behavior, the most important step to intervene is at the stage of the rumbling behavior. I am using the analogy of an earthquake. In the initial stages of the earthquake, in the beginning stage, you hear the rumbling behavior. And that is the stage when the preventive strategies can be most effective. What are some behaviors to look for at this stage? Or is the student making some noises? Is he or she fidgety? Is he kind of tapping his feet? Is she tensing her muscles? Is there some kind of a rapid movement that I observe? Are there tears in the eyes? Is the student making some kind of verbal threats? So we have to take action before we get into the meltdown stage, at the stage of the rumbling behavior. And then once they move into the meltdown or the rage stage, we really need to let go and let that meltdown move on. There is not much we can do at this stage. This is not the stage to touch the student because he may become even more violent or aggressive, and let the meltdown work itself out. And then the next stage is the meltdown followed by a recovery. And especially young children may end up just falling asleep after a severe meltdown. And then they may not even remember they had a meltdown. And when they have calmed down, and again, immediately after a calm down, we cannot begin an intervention. But when they are calm at a later time, maybe an hour later or at the end of the day, we can teach some of the calming techniques and how to, that's when we focus on guiding the child how to calm himself down. So as far as we are concerned, as educators, as teachers, as administrators, or as therapists, what can we do in terms of the environmental support in order to help children handle their routines and their classroom instruction better? We are going to be looking at the supports that we can place for them. First and foremost, most of us know a structured environment is critical with predictability and consistency of routines for children with autism. What it does is it helps to reduce the stress level and the anxiety level, which often trigger the tantrums. So we certainly cannot have, we are going to be doing videos today because it's our fun day today. Because then we are swaying away from our routines, and children with autism spectrum disorders will not be able to suddenly switch to a routine where we are going to be watching videos for the next 2 hours, or we are going to be just doing, just playing games for the next 2 hours. And the other thing is, in terms of environmental support, many children with autism spectrum disorders get very nervous, and their stress level goes up when they are in an overstimulating environment, usually the gym, the cafeteria, or in their community setting. So we do need to prepare them very much in advance. Let's say, how do we get a child used to the cafeteria and the noise level and the number of people in the cafeteria? One thing we can do is take them to the cafeteria when nobody is there, and so they get familiar with that. And then arrange for them to eat lunch at a time when there are not that many students, so that the stimulation level is reduced. And then similarly, we can put in place some preventives so that they don't lead to tantrums for environments that are overstimulating. Again, coming back to the classroom, we do need to have some designated work areas. From time to time, bring them into the group setting, and then at the time when they need to have a break, let them have a safe space where they can go and have breaks. And by the way, we need to make sure that they have scheduled, timed breaks. They will not be able to work for hours on end, maybe 10 minutes, and we have to gradually build their tolerance level for work, and then we have to make sure that breaks are built into their schedule. And when I talk about the designated work area, I'm going to be mentioning about the work system later on in the academic support, but they do need to have an area where they can go and do some work independently in addition to the group activities. And we also have to make sure those transitions that they go through from one activity to another, from one setting to another, from one environment to the other, also from one person to the other, are calm, smooth, and predictable in order to prevent tantrums. So we move on now to visual support. There is clear evidence that shows that children with autism spectrum disorders, they have strengths in the area of visual learning. So that is certainly an area where we want to make sure that we provide supports to them. It is absolutely essential right from early childhood on to have a visual schedule for them. We can have text, but that text, the words that say, okay, math time, science time, social studies time, gym time, playground time, that should be paired a visual picture. The text paired with visual pictures. And as the student progresses to the middle school or at the high school level, we want to make sure these visual supports, the visual schedule, is somewhat discrete and it is inside a bounder, and the student himself or herself is trained in self-management so that he himself says, okay, I have done this activity, next I am moving on to the next one. So he moves that picture and the text for the next activity to the activities to do, and then the activity that's finished in the activities finished section. And the other thing that I mentioned previously in terms of environmental support is a designated safe space. I would strongly recommend there is a place in the classroom that is not a timeout, but a safe space. I often call it the Hawaiian Island, a designated space where the student can go and take a break with the timer. You don't want the student to abuse that time, so maybe 2 minutes, maybe 3 minutes, maybe initially it is a larger frame of time, and then gradually the time is reduced. And he can engage in preferred activity, and those activities are available in this designated safe space. The other things that I often recommend, those things, the pictures that you see with the picture of the designated safe space, and stop, and sometimes, we want a certain behavior to stop, like a stop screaming or stop shouting. We just have that picture and show that picture pair with the text so that we want to immediately stop that behavior, and then we want this child to do whatever behavior we want. If the child is running, no running, turn around and sit in chair. So kind of simple rules paired with text. And that is put on a ring, key ring, and whoever is supporting the student, it may be a paraeducator, it may be the teacher, carries that small little ring with them everywhere, and gradually we train the student to look at those, and he himself, kind of imparts himself how to use those rules as we show them the ring, and as we point to the card, the student is trained to also look at the card and kind of, oh, I need to stop screaming. So this is very, very important to use, but initially we are just training the student, and gradually we are enabling the student to use these rules by himself. Now we are moving into the area of how do we provide academic support. What are some characteristics of children with autism that may impact their academic performance and unlocking that academic potential? Here I want to share a little story that I read several years ago in the Scientific American, and this author talks about how when the author was in about 5th grade, his brother, Alex, he started correcting his homework. And this would not have been strange except for the fact this young child was in kindergarten. And the author himself was in 5th grade. And this young child, kindergartner, frequently engaged in repetitive behaviors, and often they got calls at home to come and pick him up because he engaged in inappropriate behaviors, and he was often kicked out, he says, because he was not able to sit still in the classroom, even for a few seconds at a time. And he used to be able to look at his brother's paper and look at the neatly written words and make the corrections, and also look at the math problems and find out which were wrong. And he was not able to engage in appropriate behavior or even sit still in the classroom. That is why it is extremely important for us to understand the learning and the cognitive characteristics. They may have that potential, and we have to provide the support in order to unlock that potential. Often, children with autism spectrum disorder, this is an identified characteristic, and they may have attention problem, an organization problem, organizing themselves, organizing their work, finding their work, and it will impact their behavior. And when they cannot find their work, they may get frustrated and they may not be able to communicate and say, I need help. Instead, they may engage in crying, screaming, throwing all the papers on the floor, and you may have seen some of these behaviors. And the next problem they may have would be sequencing the information, recognizing the relationships between the first instruction that was given and the last instruction. So multiple step instructions are a challenge for them. And frequently, they may see only the facts. When you say, can you find X in this problem? What we mean is find the value of X. They may think of it as circling the X. And they may not always clearly understand the cut. Children may be playing with blocks. The child with autism may go in there and take the blocks from another child who is building a structure and not realizing that he is hurting the other child who is built some block structure, and he cannot just go and disrupt that activity and grab that block. And we know that many, many children with autism have difficulty imitating the behaviors. In order to accommodate their social communication and behavior outcome, what are some things we can do to provide support? We have to make sure that our instructional delivery, the task demands, and the rigors match the student's strengths and needs. While we can give most of the time multiple step directions to all the other children, we have to make sure our child with autism spectrum disorder has a grasp of what we have said, so the instructions frequently have to be paired with visuals, or we may have to provide that instruction one-on-one, supported with visual. And a visual organizer displaying the various steps to complete an activity would be most helpful. One of the things that has been very helpful in increasing the independent task completion, as well as increasing attention and focus, and completing tasks without the need for adult support, has been the work systems. And in this context, before I move on to the next slide, I do want to re-emphasize the need for timed breaks for children with autism spectrum disorder. We have to make sure that we provide the communication support, and many of these slides are linked together, and if you go to the work system, you will find that there is a lot of information about work system in research, and evidence supports that the child has a system that is set up where the child begins an activity, completes that activity, moves it to the finished area, and then takes some kind of a preferred activity as he completes the activity and finishes all the tasks independently. And these should be tasks that the student can do independently because these are tasks the student has demonstrated already mastery. And we have to also make sure that we take advantage of technology, but the technology should match the student's needs and the functioning level. The other thing that I want to emphasize is frequently we use over-prompting. We depend heavily on hand prompting, which is fine at the initial stage, but we have to ensure we gradually fade those prompts in order to make the student independent. The technology that's really emerging to enable students both in terms of academic tasks, functional tasks, and social communication and social narratives in order for students to engage in social communication, social experiences, is to use video technology. There are a lot of free videos available, but you can also go to the Autism Internet modules, which is listed in the Autism resources, and you will have helpful ideas to prepare your video as well as some model videos for us to help them in increasing their functioning level. And one of the most important things that I mentioned as one of the characteristics is children with autism, as you know very well, have very strong preferred interests. So if we can kind of build that interest into the activities, we will heighten the motivation for those students. So flexibility in our approach, especially in adjusting the task demands and the task rigor, is a win-win for the child and a win-win for the adult working with the child. If we give a child 30 problems on a worksheet, the student looks at the problem and gets immediately stressed out and increases the anxiety level, and he fails to even start. So if we can tailor that and say, you know what, why don't you do the first 5 problems and go take a 2-minute break and then come back and finish the last 5 problems. I know I am not requiring the student to do all 30 problems, but if we can gradually build a tolerance level for work, we are at a win-win. And also we can say, okay, if you do this work for the next 10 minutes, at the end of 10 minutes, you can have 3 minutes of timed computer work, and then, or you can feed the fish, or you can go feed the plant. And this is where there is a tool, assistive technology tool, available from AbleNet, which I will show you in one of the slides later. It's called Talking Bricks Communicator. You can program that to say, okay, you're starting this activity, and about 3 minutes or 5 minutes before the end of that break or end of that activity, you can go and say, okay, press this blue button, and it will program to say, okay, the activity will end or the break will end in 3 minutes, and then the red stop sign or the red sign will say the activity is over. And as I said, technology can increase their communication ability. It can be used to increase their interaction skills. And for those students with higher functioning level, we can have them do PowerPoint presentation using technology, mainstream technology. We can have them do book reports. We can get them to do book summary. We can get them to do email. So technology can be used to, and we all know that many children with autism spectrum disorder somehow have that attraction or preference for using technology. So let's use that preference to maximize their outcome. So the talking bricks communicator that I mentioned is the one with the blue, the red, and the green button. And one thing that I want to mention, many of these tools are available from AbleNet, and there are other tools from other technology companies as well as assistive technology companies that sell supports. One piece of warning that I do want to mention, or piece of caution, frequently I find when I go to visit classrooms as a consultant, we seem to begin with assistive technology device that has maybe 32 icons and 64 locations, which seems to be overwhelming. And often the key holding the student's hand and finger and kind of taking it to press the icon. So it is better to start with something simpler, with something that has maybe 8 locations, like the Super Talker from AbleNet, or this one that you see here, a Quick Talker. And if you want to even cover up the other icons with a kind of a blank piece of paper or not have any pictures, and then gradually increase their mastery of using the device and then add more icons and begin with basic wants and needs and then connecting it with increasing their vocabulary, increasing their social communication aided with technology. Okay, now I'm moving on to certain case scenarios. I do want to mention, because of the time limitations, I may or may not be able to cover every one of the slides, but I will try my best because I do want to give you some time to have some chat questions. But some of the other scenarios is something that you can take back as your own problem-solving situation. This is a scenario often teachers present to me, and that is like Amina. She tries to grab items from her peers who are seated near her. She reaches across, and when the teacher tries to stop her, she tries to bite the teacher's hand, or it happens with the paraeducator who works with her. One of the first things that I would teach Amina is personal space. There are 2 things that we can do at this. We can have, using masking tape, we can draw a visual boundary on that desk to say, this is Amina's workspace. Amina keeps her hands within that workspace. Similarly, around her desk and chair on the floor, we have a masking tape, a square that shows a visual boundary using masking tape and say, Amina stays within that space when Amina is working. And you can take a photo of that personal space and teach her how to use that. And in addition to that, some of the things that you may want to say is, Amina, when she is working, she keeps her hands to herself. Amina, hands to yourself is a simple skill that you want to, so that not only do you provide preventives, you also teach her how to keep her hands to herself. What does Amina do with her hand? She keeps it on the desk when she is working. So that's one thing. The next scenario is, as I mentioned earlier, it is extremely important to follow a consistent, predictable routine for children with autism spectrum disorders. This is a scenario that I came across myself in a self-contained classroom that served students with significant disabilities, and there were several students with autism as well as a couple of other students with significant intellectual disabilities. And On this Friday, the teacher was absent, and the substitute teacher decided, along with the two para-educators, that they will have a fun Friday with showing videos and playing some games, and then they will spend the last hour in the afternoon doing some cooking activities. And as the visitor walked in, the scene in the classroom was one of mayhem. There was one student who was under the desk, and two students were pacing around the room. One was flapping his arms, another engaged in self-injurious behavior because the routine was taken out of the day, and the students really did not know what to do because students cannot engage in a video for a very long time. It can be for a 10-minute period. It can be for a 12-minute period. Then they need to have a transition to an activity that's somewhat more motivating, that's somewhat more hands-on, and that also follows the consistent routine of the previous other Fridays of the week. So I cannot overemphasize the need to follow a predictable routine. And if there is a change in the routine, like the substitute teacher, even for that situation, we need to prepare our students with autism, because we need to be able to have a photo there saying, okay, today the teacher, Mrs. Marino, is not going to be there. We are going to have a substitute teacher, so that even that kind of an advanced preparation is necessary in order to prevent triggering tantrums. I'm going to quickly go over this one, and this is another situation where the teacher was working with a group of students, and she was working on the vocabulary words. As she was going over the words, and she was flashing one by one the flashcards, there was a student with autism spectrum disorder. He was kind of falling off the chair repeatedly, and he was really not paying any attention. How do we get this student to engage? How do we get the student to attend? The teacher can reprimand and have verbal threats, but it didn't seem to make any difference for this student. First of all, we need to look at the instruction itself. How could the vocabulary words be presented in a different way? Could a game format where they are playing it like a bingo game, or can we play it like a simple charades game? Could we play it in such a way in order to increase the motivation as well as provide an opportunity for that student with autism to have a little bit of movement and hands-on? The second idea could be that we enable that student, after he is sitting there for about 10 minutes, to go and take a quick 3-minute break and come back, timed break, come back and join the group. That's another possibility. And this also has to be, we have to think in terms of how do we maximally engage, but at the same time, and actually, when we approach the whole thing, how do we make the activity more motivating for all of them so that they retain the information that's taught? Then it's not only going to benefit my student with autism spectrum disorder, but it's also going to benefit all of the other students in order to be more receptive to the information. And then end that kind of session with a kind of a positive, encouraging statement. Oh, Alex, or you sat nicely and listened, or you participated, kind of an encouraging statement so that that behavior is repeated. We have about a minute, and this is a overstimulating environment. What can we do? Again, advanced preparation. And let's say when we go to an assembly and we go there for a program, it is important that we sit at the outer end of that assembly so that we can have a quick getaway from that environment before the environment triggers a tantrum. Now I would like to move on to chat. So I'm going to quickly go through the next few slides, and I want to point out that whatever slides I have not covered, I am going to be presenting a seminar again later this month. I will try to include them in that webinar, brief explanation of those slides, because I think it's important we touch on all of these things, but you can in the meanwhile review some of these slides. What I do want to point out is working with students with autism spectrum disorder, it can be challenging, but it can be very rewarding because of the complexity of their characteristics. But the more you learn about their unique characteristics and understand their needs and reflect and respond in a reflective mode, we increase and maximize their outcomes. So let us use preventives, positives, and flexibility. And I also want to mention at this point, there are a lot of resources that are included, including my books and the laminated guide and everything. Take a look at them. And I would like to now move on to the chat questions. And these slides are available. So if you have any questions, do put them in the chat box, and I will move over to the chat box if you have some questions. So it looks like no one has any questions. So I want to point out then some of the resources that are available. National Professional Development Center has great resources. And as I said, I also have a paraeducator training manual that school districts can use, and there is an autism unit for paraeducator training embedded within that. It's a separate unit for training paraeducators because increasingly they're providing the support. And the other great resource is called the Autism Internet Module. And only problem is it's a vast ocean of resources, and one of the things that you may want to look at there is the workstation that I mentioned, work systems. The other one is social narratives, which works like the social stories, but very similar to that one. And the third resource that you may want to look up is the video technology. Thank you very much. And the next webinar will be looking at the transition techniques for children with autism spectrum disorders. And as I promised, I will also include some of the slides, the social support, and the crisis support in the next webinar. It will be on September 30th. And again, it is the same time. I made a mistake there. It's actually from 11 to 12 Central Daylight Time. I have it as 10 to 11. It's 10 to 11 Eastern Daylight Time. And I will keep looking to see for the next couple of minutes if there are any chat questions. I don't see anything, but again, let me again say, let's pursue preventives and positives and flexibility in our approach to children with autism spectrum disorders. It will be a win-win for children. It will be a win-win for us because it will certainly reduce our stress level, and it will also be a win-win for the families who also face challenges with their children with autism spectrum disorder. Thank you very much for participating in this webinar. And again, I want to thank AbleNet for organizing these webinars. There is a question here, and that says, what techniques could be used for a child who will not remain in designated spot even briefly? Yes, that's a very good question. One of the things, two things I would say is we teach the child, let's say, if the child is a very young child and you have circle time, you want to make sure if the child has a mat, we put a photo of the child on the mat, and we also have a designated spot in that circle time with a visual boundary using masking tape where the child is trained to go to that designated spot. He or she carries the mat to that designated spot and sits there, and we practice that again and again. Initially, it may be just 30 seconds that the child is sitting. And then we gradually build that tolerance. If the child is an older child and if the child is sitting at a desk and a chair, again, this is a situation. I actually came across a child who is about first grade age, but he was about 7. He kept wandering around. And so we put a photo of the child on the desk paired with his name. And similarly, we put a photo of the child on his chair paired with his name. And he was required to sit there. Initially, it was for 30 seconds, and he could engage in a preferred task. It could be something like a tangled toy that he's playing with, or maybe he's playing with a push ball, or he is taking some pictures using Velcro and placing it next to a text. Depending on the functioning level, you provide this. And then you increase it to 3 minutes, and then increase it to 5 minutes. You keep increasing the demands, and you gradually build tolerance. And there is the next question, and that asks, how early would you introduce assistive technology? I would say as soon as possible. You can begin with a very simple tool, like the big mat that most of us are familiar with, or the proximity device, maybe as early as 2.5, 2. However, I am not an assistive technology specialist, let me admit. However, I have found it very effective for children 3 years and up, because it's clearly research shows that communication, about 75% of preschoolers with autism spectrum disorders can develop useful speech, and the assistive technology will definitely enable and enhance that. Okay, the next question is, how do you handle a child that is in safe space to calm himself? Do you let him participate in an activity or just calm himself? First of all, the purpose of the safe space is really to calm himself. And one of the calming techniques you would use is for him to learn to take deep breaths. And then gradually, if you can place one thing in that place, that he can immediately, if it is a child who likes to draw, you can certainly place some crayons and markers and paper. Or if it is a child who likes to play, let's say, with video games or something like that, you can place that one item. Initially, it may be the calming area, maybe in a longer period of time, and then it should be timed, and he should return back to his task. So the child doesn't use that as an opportunity to kind of continue to be in that calming area. And also, you have to, I do not know the particular child, so you have to make sure that you tailor it to the child's needs and try it. And in education, it's always a trial and error, and these are some best practices, and try and see what works. And so I'm going to move on to the safe area to do a preferred task and not be cooperative to leave to re-engage. Yes, he has to re-engage with the teaching instruction or with peers after the timed period in the safe space is over. Initially, the safe space time may be longer, but then that period has to be shortened further and further so that we increase task and time. But I do want to say something here. It is very difficult to imagine. Some children, there are exceptions, but many children with autism spectrum disorders are going to have a difficult time engaging in appropriate tasks or group instruction for any length of time. So it has to be more like 15, 20 minutes. And that's why I combine it, group activity, with the independent workstation. And I'm going to answer the next one, then I'm going to stop at that point because it's about 12:05. What do you suggest for a student that goes into another classroom for inclusion but has a meltdown when they get to the classroom door? Okay, this is a very good question. This is going to be addressed a little bit further in the next webinar because this involves transition to a new classroom, involves a transition to a new person in the other classroom. When I say new, it is a change of person from the present classroom. So you have to make sure whoever is taking that person prepares that person in advance, even if he has gone every day. The student has to be reminded of the change that is occurring with visual support paired with text. Advanced preparation for that transition to the new activity and to the new person. Thank you very much. Since it is 6 minutes past 12 o'clock Central Daylight Time, I have to say goodbye now. I'll meet you again at the next webinar. Thank you very much.